The motto of the Olympic Games is faster, higher, stronger, and the same applies for the Cold War between the two superpowers in the 20th century. Now, throughout their entire standoff, both sides tried to outdo each other in almost everything, specifically weapons and technology. And today, we will see the results of that competition because we will check out the fastest and most powerful planes from both sides. For example, the MiG-31 that I'm standing on right now. Its mission is to hunt ballistic missiles and satellites.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy ever faced mankind in its lifetime. Foreign dollar MiGs are 27.3.
The MiG-31 can reach the boundaries of near space, climbing to an altitude of more than 20 kilometers.
Небо над тобой, оно становится уже серым. Уже виден легкий-легкий изгиб Земли.
But the superpowers involved in the arms race were trying to take planes even higher, straight to the stars.
Все идет из логики «Звездных войн» в том или ином виде.
Incredibly destructive weapons that could cross the globe in half an hour or possibly be stationed over our heads, in which we could wipe out all the people on the face of the earth.
I'm Marina Kostrova, and today I'll be taking a look at unique military equipment created during the Cold War era, including supersonic fighters as well as space and rocket planes. Late 1970s, a Tu-95 bomber takes off from a Soviet airfield. The Tu-95 was an important component in the USSR's nuclear triad. It usually carried rockets armed with atomic bombs, but not during these secret tests. Have a look. Before takeoff, a smaller plane was attached to it. At an altitude of 6,000 meters and a speed of 420 kilometers per hour, a small plane with a test pilot on board detaches. Successfully lands on the runway of a test facility. When you first look at this little plane, it may not look like anything special, but it was actually a milestone in the space confrontation between the USSR and the United States. The Soviet military nicknamed it Space Lapot. Now, Lapot are ancient Russian bass shoes made from tree bark, and they look something like this. Now, personally, I think that the nose of the plane looks more like a duck, but if they thought bass shoes, then bass shoes it is. And they were supposed to eliminate American satellite fighters. In the 1960s, the Soviet engineers were tasked with designing a plane for space combat. At the time, it seemed space was about to become a theater of war between the two superpowers. The project was dubbed Спираль.
Это был космический истребитель, который должен был вести, вот только вдуматься, да, маневренный космический бой. У него на борту были ракеты «Космос-Космос». То есть он подлетал, соответственно, к цели, он ее обнаружил, мог стрелять там с дистанции сколько-то, десятков километров, вот, мог инспектировать.
Плюс параллельно ведет съемку каких-то объектов на территории вероятного противника. Ну и, соответственно, мог делать, наверное, такой атмосферный нырок до высоты 60-70 километров, сход с орбиты и бомбардировка, возможно, сброс специзделия или ядерной бомбы, если хотите.
One of the ways for using this little plane was to eliminate American targets on the ground and in space. Soviet scientists assumed that it would have to guide missiles with a nuclear warhead directly from space while remaining outside the detection zone of US tracking systems. Now, can you tell me, how did it work?
У него устанавливался для маневрирования турбореактивный двигатель, для того, чтобы он мог, так сказать, осуществлять сход с орбиты и возвращаться, так сказать, на Землю. Плюс он мог нести, так сказать, вооружение, соответственно, которое должно быть на крыльях подвешено. Либо, значит, вариант мог размещаться, это оружие размещалось бы в корпусе, в самом несущем. Вот. Летчик один, кабина одноместная.
The Soviet engineers designed the spaceplane to climb to an altitude of 30 kilometers on the back of a special aircraft, then detach and enter orbit with the help of a rocket booster, and finally return to an airfield after completing its mission.
Летчик мог катапультироваться в космосе. То есть из орбитального самолета он выстреливался внутри капсулы, уже эта капсула, в этой капсуле он входил в атмосферу и снижался.
This footage of spaceplane tests was shot for the tiny number of specialists that were involved in this unique project. You might notice the aircraft's unconventional design. This allowed it to land on any airfield or runway, paved or unpaved. It's hard to believe, but it was Hitler's Third Reich that came up with the idea of an orbiting plane. It was in Nazi Germany that the first project for producing a space plane appeared. It was dubbed Silverbird. After the war, Stalin tasked Soviet special services with finding its inventor, Eugene Sanger. But they were too late. The Allies had already gotten to this amazing German physicist first.
His idea was to have a space plane that would take off from Germany and orbit the Earth. And as it orbited the Earth over the United States, it would be able to drop a bomb on New York City. It was a space plane, similar in concept to the space shuttle. That would be launched from Germany. It would orbit the Earth and return to Germany, having gone around the Earth, and land. And it would drop its weapons on the United States en route. That was never built. The Germans never deployed such a thing.
Sanger's drawings and calculations, which the Allies got their hands on after the war, formed the basis for America's Dyna Soar spaceplane project, which was supposed to be the super weapon of the future. Several mock-ups of the ship were built, and a squad of astronauts was even recruited. But the program was soon shut down.
Dyna Soar was an early attempt to create a hypersonic manned aircraft that could fly to orbit and re-enter the atmosphere and glide and land like an airplane.
Самолет рассматривался в разных вариантах. И перехватчика, и ударного бомбардировщика. Перехватчика, естественно, космических спутников противника, вероятно, коим мы для Америки в то время являлись. И узнав об этом, естественно, мы уже готовились, как говорится, к противостоянию в космосе.
I can tell you the reason why it was canceled was because it failed. We are only now at the point where we have enabling technologies that allow us to begin to build hypersonic aircraft.
In the 1960s, the world is gripped by fear that a war will break out between the two superpowers. In 1961, this almost comes to pass due to a dispute over the status of West Berlin. Nikita Khrushchev, head of the USSR, demanded that American President John F. Kennedy withdraw US forces from Berlin, along with British and French troops. However, the US strengthened its military contingent in response. This went down in history as the Berlin Crisis. A little more than a year later, a nuclear war nearly broke out when the Americans discovered that Soviet missiles had been deployed in Cuba, an event now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Карибский кризис. Это же фактически ракетный кризис. То есть мы просто-напросто подтянули ракеты среднего радиуса действия, но на Кубу.
Вообще говоря, истоки его лежат в размещении Соединенными Штатами Америки баллистических ракет «Юпитер» в Турции то есть рядом с границами Советского Союза.
The United States and the Soviet Union were on a collision course from the end of World War II on. And in that context, there's this broad competition taking place in all kinds of settings, was in the context of military and especially nuclear weapons, in which we could wipe out all the people on the face of the earth.
Neither side wanted the matter to turn into a genuine confrontation. In 1967, after assessing the risks of triggering a global space war, the USSR, USA, and UK concluded an agreement that banned the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit, on celestial bodies such as the moon, and on space stations. But it is no coincidence that the document does not mention other types of weapons. Of course, no one was going to completely abandon military space programs. On the contrary, the space race was just picking up speed, and it entered a new round when reusable spacecraft appeared. In 1969, the US begins developing a space transportation system, later known as the Space Shuttle.
The space shuttle could have been used as a weapon. Some declassified information has come out that the United States even considered using it that way. Space shuttle could be used as a space weapon of some kind, either as a bomber or as an anti-satellite weapon. But what did those studies conclude? No, it didn't make sense to do that.
There was some military activity and some classified missions on the space shuttle, but it was not a military vehicle at all. The Soviets may have felt differently about that because they clearly believed that there was a military purpose to the space shuttle.
Когда возник вот этот вот шаттл, при том, что там мы видим, участвует Пентагон и вообще его характеристики под Пентагон, то это стопроцентная война. Мы не понимаем зачем, мы не понимаем что. Вот, но мы начинаем прорабатывать ответ.
Moscow closely followed the program's development and suspected the worst. In the USSR, the reasoning was this. What if the shuttle was carrying nuclear weapons into space and not scientific equipment? And if the shuttle knows how to take its satellites out of orbit, why wouldn't it steal others? In response to the space shuttle program, the Soviet Union began developing a similar space system in 1974. Work on this was expedited after April 12, 1981, when the American space shuttle Columbia first rocketed into orbit. The Soviet version of the space shuttle was dubbed the Buran. Originally, the Buran had a military purpose. It was developed as a super spaceship, a weapon of the future, a soldier in case of a space war, which at that moment, once again, seemed quite real. It was assumed that the Buran would be able to deploy space mines and create entire space minefields. Its designers saw the situation as something like this. American satellites tried to advance and suddenly came upon an obstacle they could not get around. The Buran was supposed to put combat stations equipped with interceptor missiles and laser weapons into orbit. It was also tasked with tracking enemy satellites and removing them from orbit if necessary. And that was not all of its capabilities.
Мы получили информацию неожиданно на мысе Канаверал о том, что многоразовый орбитальный корабль «Шаттл» может делать атмосферный нырок. При сходе с орбиты он мог делать нырок над Москвой. И, соответственно, мог сбросить какое-то изделие, ядерную бомбу или любую, так сказать, применить оружие. Поэтому в ответ быстро было принято постановление 17 февраля 1976 года об исследовании возможности ведения боевых действий в космосе и из космоса.
Конструктивная схема Бурана была более прогрессивна, чем у Space Shuttle. Вы знаете, что Space Shuttle, там стоит основной двигатель, и маневр ограничен. У Бурана, в принципе, маневр не ограничен. Предусмотрено, что Буран может нырять на высоту до 40 километров.
Был вариант изготовления Бурана в ударном варианте, когда он как бомбардировщик вез на себе вот эти вот боевые блоки, но, соответственно, там объем позволял разместить ядерные боеприпасы. Вот.
Bohr rocket planes were to deliver nuclear warheads. Before that, they were used in the Spiral project for testing orbital aircraft. Now, they were to become the Buran's main weapon.
Собственно, эти боры – это прототипы боевых блоков, который должен был нести многоразовый орбитальный корабль «Буран».
Okay, and how did it work?
У него есть внутри грузовой отсек. Грузовой отсек открывается, створки его открываются, и внутри 2 револьверные установки. Каждая револьверная установка по 5 вот таких боров. То есть они могли быть, так сказать, в ядерном варианте, могли быть в обычном варианте, так сказать. И когда прокручивается, ну, вот как пистолет, да, револьвер, да, то есть барабан прокручивается, вылетает бор, вылетает бор, вылетает бор и так далее. И они, каждый имеет свою цель.
They're huge, and how many would a Buran fit?
10.
It looks like they couldn't possibly fit.
Грузовой отсек достаточно просторный был. В нем могли размещаться не просто эти револьверные установки, еще были боевые ударные комплексы планировалось.
In 1982, Bohr testing in the Indian Ocean really stirred up the U.S. military and their allies.
Первые, значит, эти беспилотные орбитальные ракетопланы, они приводнялись в Индийском океане. Для того, чтобы его, собственно, спасти и поднять на борт, для этого дежурили силы военно-морского флота. Корабли измерительного комплекса, которые у нас базировались на Камчатке, приходили в Индийский океан.
2 месяца, пока корабли шли в место посадки, соответственно, их передвижение отслеживали. Когда они уже подошли как бы в эту точку стояния, да, там, естественно, их ждали уже и палубная авиация, и австралийские «Орионы», которые фотографировали вот это все.
All the drama of the Cold War standoff can clearly be seen in this footage. Australian helicopters are hovering so low over the Soviet ships that the sailors on their decks can actually see the faces of the pilots, while reconnaissance planes are flying at the lowest possible altitude. This archive footage, which was classified up until recently, was available only to the highest military officials. It clearly shows that the propeller of a reconnaissance plane is not spinning. But it's not broken. The propeller has been specially locked to allow the aircraft to fly as low as possible. And this makes it possible to take photographs in which you can see absolutely everything, right down to the rivets. And here things get truly tense. The Bohr splashes down into the ocean. Now they have to retrieve it as quickly as possible before the NATO ships snatch it out of the water.
Когда он только приводнялся, он подавал сигнал, корабли устремлялись к нему. Каждый бор имел систему подрыва на случай его захвата вероятным противником, чтобы не достался противнику. То есть практически это была плавучая мина, да. И если бы противник подошел, то мог раздаться взрыв. Вмешательство любое могло привести к этому. Поэтому наши специалисты его, так сказать, обезвреживали, а потом уже катерами его подтаскивали к бортам кораблей и под кранами поднимали, собственно, на борт.
But the reconnaissance planes did manage to take pictures of the Bohr, which were immediately dispatched to the CIA and NASA.
Аппарат падает на волну и плавает и так далее. То есть, в общем, были сделаны прекраснейшие снимки. Они потом были рассекречены спустя какое-то время. И облик аппарата был совершенно понятен. Поэтому коммерческие фирмы могут использовать эту конфигурацию. И сейчас вот они, соответственно, используют в одном из проектов вот этого орбитального самолета.
Now let's compare 2 photographs. Here is one from a Soviet Bohr taken in the Indian Ocean in 1982. And we have one of the Dream Chaser, a spacecraft that is being developed right now by the United States. Doesn't it feel like both space planes were designed by the same people? It's no coincidence that Bohr rocket planes were earmarked as lethal submunition for the Buran. The designers were not only developing an alternative to the space shuttle, The Buran was supposed to protect the USSR from America's Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI for short, which had been announced by President Ronald Reagan.
It is part of a careful, long-term plan to make America strong again after too many years of neglect and mistakes.
SDI was immediately nicknamed the Star Wars program, and it seemed threatening indeed.
Reagan was a diehard Cold Warrior, and quite frankly, he brought to the office when he took power in 1981 that particular belief system. And he fundamentally believed that the Soviet Union was, and he used this term over and over again, the evil empire, and it needed to be destroyed.
Они грезили о том, что да, в космосе будут, так сказать, размещаться какие-то ударные системы, которые будут противостоять и угрожать территории Советского Союза и стран Варшавского договора. Это все страны практически Восточной Европы и часть нашей Азии. То получается, что нам нужно было защищаться. Для этого вот как раз создавалась эта Буран.
SDI, the United States Strategic Defense Initiative, had purposes aside from defense, according to experts, and Moscow shared that point of view. When Mikhail Gorbachev took the helm of the USSR, the frosty relations between the two countries began to thaw. But even then, the United States was not ready to abandon SDI. In October of 1986, the leaders of the USSR and US, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, met halfway between Moscow and Washington, in Iceland's capital, Reykjavik, where they discussed plans to drastically reduce their country's nuclear arms stockpiles. The intense negotiations lasted 2 days. The members of the delegations literally didn't sleep trying to align their positions. Gorbachev offered serious concessions in terms of disarmament, but on one condition: the United States should limit itself only to laboratory tests in its SDI program. Ronald Reagan vehemently objected to this proposal. The Pentagon would not abandon the militarization of space. The leader of the USSR didn't hide his irritation at this when he met journalists after the meeting.
Президент настаивал до конца на том, чтобы Америка имела право испытывать, исследовать и испытывать все, что относится к СОИ, не только в лабораториях, но и за пределами, в том числе и в космосе. Ну кто же на это пойдет?
The usual take on this is that Reagan was such a true believer in his dream of rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete with these space weapons, SDI, etc. He was such a true believer in this that he just wouldn't give it up.
However, the Star Wars system would never actually materialize. Many of the system's components were impossible to make at the time, though some of the ideas from the program have been implemented today, when a war in space no longer seems as far-fetched as in the 1980s.
You know, were things deployed in space that are weapons that could have been used? I don't know. My suspicion is probably not. They create so many unintended consequences with their use, it's better just not to have them at all. But that may not have been the direction that either the American military or the Soviet military took.
It's the fastest airplane ever flown.
Скорость была достаточно, 3,2 Маха.
It flew higher and faster than any vehicle has ever flown before.
Если поставить задачу, будет выполнять.
The Cold War space race led to the creation of unique flying machines with incredible designs. And what happened at higher altitudes? How did the confrontation develop in near space? And why did the Soviet Union need a superplane capable of climbing into the stratosphere and flying at supersonic speeds?